The US government has locked horns with the World Anti-Doping Agency over its handling of Chinese doping allegations. This month, the US chose to hold back its $5.8 million annual contribution, more than 13% of the money WADA gets from governments. Since 2002, national governments have agreed to pay half of WADA's core funding. Countries with a greater number of elite athletes pay more of their continent's share. The Olympic movement then matches that direct government funding under a 50-50 model. Well, Catherine Ordway is an associate professor in sport management and sport integrity lead at the University of Canberra. I asked her what the US withdrawal means for WADA.
The World Anti-Doping Agency has done an extensive amount of investigation and liaison with the Chinese authorities, including the Chinese Anti-Doping Authority, in relation to this, what's been found to be a contamination case. So it involved 23 Chinese swimmers. There were in fact 28 positive tests, and it related to a product that is found in heart medication. And the reason that was given by the Chinese authorities for this heart medication being found in the athletes' samples to a very minuscule amount. It should be very clear that it was a very, very tiny amount that was found in any of these samples, and it was found that it would not have had any performance benefit, and there was no indication that any of these athletes were taking it for any kind of doping or cheating purposes. So the finding was that it was an inadvertent contamination, and it had been caused by somebody in the kitchen at the hotel where the athletes were staying, somehow dropping it into the soup. So one of my friends, who is a chef, indicated that sometimes that does happen, that things fall out of your pocket when you're making a soup or a curry, which is a bit alarming for all of us that eat in restaurants and hotels around the world to know how common this could be. But certainly that was the excuse that was used by the Chinese authorities, and after the investigation it was accepted by the World Anti-Doping Agency, and they also had an independent advisor come in and review all the information to see whether the World Anti-Doping Agency finding was acceptable, and he found that it was. That hasn't satisfied the US authorities, of course. The US Anti-Doping Authority has been very loud and in its criticisms of this finding, and a number of other anti-doping agencies around the world, including Australia's, at Sport Integrity Australia, have felt some disquiet and concern with this finding.
Of course, the US is also pointing to Russia's quite infamous state-sponsored doping program that includes the falsifying of samples from the 2014 Sochi Winter Games. So how much pressure is WADA under from various governments and their anti-doping agencies?
I think that the World Anti-Doping Agency is under enormous pressure, of course, from all the different competing factors, whether it's from the sport federations or from the different national governments. The Russian case, as you mentioned, the state-sanctioned doping case, was actually exposed at the beginning because of whistleblowers. And there were whistleblowers that were coming out of Russia, athletes, doping control agency people, and ultimately the head of the laboratory, who spoke out about the doping program that was happening in Russia. We haven't seen that happen from China yet, or at all. Maybe in future there'll be some kind of tell-all books. We have no idea. But at this stage, the World Anti-Doping Agency has investigated what's happened in China and is happy to accept that this has been a contamination case, and that the athletes therefore are not to blame, and that they were not attempting to breach the anti-doping rules.
But what does the US cut to funding then mean for WADA and the IOC? Could there be a cascading effect that might see other countries follow suit?
Yeah, it has an enormous effect, because not only does it have a massive impact on the budget for WADA from just the US withholding their funding, it has a double effect, of course, because the International Olympic Committee won't put in funding that is the same as the US, so that's a double down there. And then the other governments around the world are starting to say, well, should we be putting in funding? Because if the World Anti-Doping Agency is a body that we can't trust, if the system is not something that is reliable, then should we also be withholding funding? So, of course, a number of different politicians from different countries, particularly within the EU environment, have jumped onto this bandwagon, have said, well, we should also be withholding funding. But actually, I think that's the wrong approach. I think the approach should be to say, let's work out how to strengthen the World Anti-Doping Agency so that they're not reliant on individual nations to call the shots in terms of what they're doing. They should not, for example, in the Russian case, be having to go to Russia cap in hand and ask for more money to be able to investigate them, because really the cost of that investigation was huge and put an enormous dent into their budget.
So if that is the case, what reforms do you think are required for WADA to be seen as a body that is independent and has a high degree of integrity?
Yes, well, I think I would like to see a situation where both the governance and the funding was removed from being so tightly held. On the one side, we've got the International Olympic Committee, and that because they have people that are in positions for 20, 30 years, then they have that stability and that kind of corporate knowledge that goes in, which is enormously powerful. On the other side, you've got the kind of churn and burn of national governments and ministers of sport, and we've seen that in our own environment in Australia, where we're changing over really quickly. And then the people from the integrity bodies, whether it was the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority or now Sport Integrity Australia, having to brief another minister and yet another minister about what the integrity environment is all about and who's who in the zoo and where are the politics and how does it all lie. That's an untenable situation for the World Anti-Doping Agency, and we need to find another option in terms of funding. So what I've suggested is that we have these brilliant social scientists around the world that know a lot about governance, they know a lot about funding and economics and so on, and we should be giving them the task of coming up with a solution. There are a number of different international bodies around the world, and we should be looking at these different models to see how to best strengthen the World Anti-Doping Agency and have some independence in their funding as not reliant on individual national governments being able to withhold and try to influence the agenda.
Yeah, but for now, WADA is facing a funding crisis. So how would this breakdown impact on the FIFA World Cup next year and the LA Olympics in 2028?
Well, absolutely. These huge events are going to have an enormous impact for the world because the US is hosting them, as you mentioned. The US is hosting the FIFA Men's World Cup jointly with Canada and Mexico, of course, who they've just called on to assist them with the devastating fires in California, but they don't want to work with them politically. So how does that translate into a sport context? Well, we're really not too sure, given they're supposed to be sitting around the table and organising this massive event jointly. So that's going to be really interesting because, of course, they're going to need to work with the law enforcement bodies of those countries. And one of the key aspects is going to be around preventing match fixing in a football setting. And in order to have good cooperation between the law enforcement bodies in Canada, Mexico and the US is going to be crucial, both from an anti-doping perspective in terms of trafficking drugs and so on, and also from an anti-match fixing perspective to make sure that there's no infiltration by organised criminals in that event. The same thing will be the case for the LA 2028 Olympic Games. The Summer Olympic Games, of course, are going to be hosted by the US, and that'll be really interesting when you've got the whole world coming there, and you'll be wanting to make sure that it is the most robust event, both from an anti-doping and from an anti-match fixing perspective. So the US has got its work cut out to maintain and re-establish, in some cases, the relationships in order to host a magnificent sporting event.
Okay, Dr. Catherine Ordway, really good to get your expertise. Thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome.